Welcome back, everyone, to part two of the context videos for Twelfth Night. And I'm going to resume my discussion of theater culture in 16th and 17th century London. So, on this slide, the main reason I'm including it is to show you that Shakespeare was one of many, many playwrights. He was not singular, he was not unique in his day and age to be a playwright. Many people saw an opportunity to make money in the professional theater because the professional theater was relatively new. It was started in England around the 1560s, 1570s, and it was centralized in London. Whereas in the past, drama was really put on by communities. It was all kind of, we could call it community theater. Sometimes there were traveling troupes that charged money, but for the most part, theater was a communal enterprise. In the 1560s forward, in London, it becomes a professional activity where people do it to make money, and they sell tickets, and they have professional theaters and professional actors. This is all what's happening in London when Shakespeare arrives. So before Shakespeare, you'll notice there are quite a few playwrights that precede him. And in fact, one of the first archival references we have of Shakespeare in London is when these two playwrights, Robert Greene and Christopher Marlowe, are complaining about Shakespeare showing up. Like, who does this guy think he is? He doesn't have a university education. He's acting like he can write these great plays. Who does he think he is? That's one of the first references to Shakespeare we have in the archives, at least in London in particular. So again, Shakespeare is part of a big crew of early modern dramatists in the period because this was a booming industry in the later part of the 16th century. Now, I want to look at this map of Elizabethan London to show you where the theaters are. The theaters are marked by these little red dots. And I want you to notice something. So you'll see a kind of thicker black line here that points to the wall surrounding London. Inside this wall is the City of London, officially. Everything outside of the wall is not part of the City of London, as it is districtly defined. And you'll notice that almost all of the red dots are outside of that wall. They're all outside of the City of London. That is intentional because the City of London outlawed theater. They thought it was a bad thing that fostered crime, it fostered bad vices, etc. So it's outlawed in London. So all the theaters crop up outside of London and what are known as the liberties. They're known as the liberties because the liberties are not governed by the city's government. They can kind of do what they want out there. So to go to the theater at all, you had to actually leave the city. You had to leave the protection of the walls. You had to go out into the kind of crazy liberties and go find a show to see there. There's one exception to this, Blackfriars, but I'm not going to get into it right now because it's not super important. The important thing is that most of these theaters exist outside of the city walls. Shakespeare actually starts his career here at the theater, and it's only later on in his career that he builds a new theater called the Globe on what is called Bankside of the Thames. And the Globe is right next to a bunch of other theaters, the Rose and the Swan, and I think there are even more that aren't on this map. So there are a lot of playwrights. There are also a lot of theaters in Elizabethan London. And an early modern map, in fact, accidentally labeled what we know as the Globe Theatre as a bear baiting garden. There were two of them right next to each other, a theater and a bear baiting garden, and they got them mixed up. And that's just another way of emphasizing how seedy the theater was, that it could be confused with a place where people let bears be attacked by dogs. You know, that's another thing that tells us, culturally speaking, the theater is a rough and tumble place. Okay, and if we look at a diagram of one of these open-air theaters, like the Globe, I want you to note that they're open air. You know, there's no roof on these theaters, which means that the plays have to be performed in daylight. And in fact, the plays were usually performed in the afternoon from 2 to 5 p.m. And the cost was 1 pence, to be a groundling, to stand here on the floor and watch the play from here. It costs more if you wanted to sit in the balconies, and even more if you wanted to sit on a higher balcony as well. So that's how the cost structure worked. And you can also imagine that people who are coming to a theater production in the middle of the day might not be holding steady work. So again, the clientele of the theater is very different than the clientele, say, of poetry. Um, Moving my head again. So one other thing I want to know about this time period are the many theater companies that existed. You'll notice that they all say Prince Charles's men, Lord Strange's men, Lord Chamberlain's men. They're all like owned by someone. There's Queen Elizabeth's men. That is because, returning to an earlier fact, actors are seen as vagrants, as people who don't have secure employment, and in fact, they can be arrested by Elizabethan constables for not having employment. To get around this, they form theater companies that are sponsored by aristocratic people, kind of like the patronage system, but in a different form. So if you're part of a theater company that is sponsored by, say, Prince Charles or Lord Chamberlain or Lord Strange or even Queen Elizabeth, then you're good. You're no longer a vagrant and you can legally work as an actor without getting arrested. Finally, notice how they're all men. It's Princess Charles's men. It's not Princess Charles' men and women or people. It's all men. Women were not permitted to act on the stage in this part of history. Only men were permitted. So these theater companies were made up of men who played grown adult men, and they were made up of younger men, kind of adolescent men, teenagers, who played women. So the teenagers played the women, and the older men played the men. So this is a exclusively male theater in which cross-dressing was built into the fabric of the theatrical enterprise. Women are always played by adolescent men, adolescent teens. And so cross-dressing is part and parcel to the experience. That'll be important as we get to a play, Twelfth Night, that focuses especially on cross-dressing. So we'll talk more about that in the theme section this week. That's all I have to say about the theatrical context. Thanks for tuning in.